Here's the long-awaited video lecture from 3 years ago on Locke that we started. This lecture is based on the notes from originally from March 30th, 2022. And we actually began discussing this before break, but before we were so unceremoniously derailed today. Although I will say this, that the more I've thought about this, in addition to living down to my reputation of never finishing my classes on time, the decision to watch The Death of Stalin in class, I think actually, the more I think about this, is quite appropriate for studying Locke, for reasons I hope to make clear, either in this lecture or in the next video lecture, or in discussing The Death of Stalin, which we'll continue to watch on Friday. If you're looking at the notes, just a little bit about Locke's political and philosophical legacy. Let me quickly walk through that, and then we'll in this lecture discuss the first of the three great reformations or reformulations of core Hobbesianism, and I in the notes I divided them into three broad areas: a different view of human nature and the state of nature. That's what we more or less began to discuss today, before being ceremoniously derailed. And then this, and you'll see this reformulation of the Hobbesian state of nature, and that was the point I was making in class today, that both Locke and Rousseau are Hobbesian, but reformulated or reformed or radicalized Hobbesians, in the sense that they accept the concept of a state of nature, that human beings' natural condition, as nature creates us, is not political. Hence the state of nature versus the other possible condition for human beings, the state of civil society. The second major area of Hobbes' teaching, which Locke and Rousseau accept but reformulate, is the nature of the sovereign, the nature of the turn to political civil society and the sovereign, in the direction of and just to go back to the first, the different view of a state of nature. I think if you want to treat each of the great authors we're teaching in this course as philosophers, and one of the things that makes them similar or different from other philosophers is the extent to which they use the unaided human mind to see the nature of the human condition in human beings, I think that Locke will argue that his version of the state of nature addresses several contradictions in Hobbes' view of the state of nature, in particular, and this was in response to, I think, a comment that Stephen made today about language. And I think I might have mentioned this prior to break, but it bears repeating here, and to emphasize the contradiction, I think, that both Locke and that both Locke and Rousseau see in Hobbes' view of the state of nature, and that is the status of language. Again, if I were contrasting this to Aristotle's teaching, or the ancients in general, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and Cicero, they would argue that human beings, the natural state of human beings, is the polis, is civil society. And that is the condition under which human nature reaches its fulfillment. The second thing that Aristotle says, to go back to the beginning of the Politics, when I teach the book one of the Politics, I talk about Aristotle's tripartite definition of human beings. Human beings are the political animal. They are, if I can use the sexist version that Aristotle uses, that man is the political animal, that man is the animal with speech, and that man is the animal with reason. So, for Aristotle, human nature containing both a political dimension, or pointing towards or including politics, as the natural condition for the emergence of human being, is inseparable from the fact that human beings are the only animal and we can talk about this both with the authors in this course or even ancient political thinkers, that we are the only animal with speech. Now, this is a complicated question, and again, I have to say it's a question to which I've paid some attention to in both biological and other kinds of research. And there's an interesting book that just came out last year or the year before, which I read, Why Chimpanzees Don't Speak or Don't Possess Language. Other animals come very close to language. Perhaps the cetacean beings, whales and dolphins in the ocean, or orangutans, chimpanzees, apes, gorillas, they come very close to the possessing of language. But it turns out that several researchers in the 70s and 80s, which seem to suggest, for instance, that the problem with detecting with chimps or apes or gorillas, for instance, not using language was they didn't have vocal cords developed like for human speech, and therefore they might be capable of language. And the experiments were done with teaching chimps or apes or gorillas sign language, and there evidently was some quasi potential there, but subsequent research suggests that was actually overblown. So for the time being, but as we pursue this question through Locke and Rousseau, it turns out it is a central question. But at least we can say this: regardless of the extent to which other animals do or don't possess speech, that a third part of the definition of human nature for Aristotle is the animal with reason. And so speech or language seems to be the platform out of which the power of self-consciousness and the ability to see the universe through the lens of reason is a unique human feature, which is also ultimately connected with the political nature of humanity. The moderns, starting with Hobbes, who's the first great formulator of the concept of the state of nature as the natural condition of human beings outside of, prior to, or not including political existence, seems to commit an error, which I think Locke and certainly Rousseau will argue needs to be corrected, and that is, if you remember, what in Hobbes's Leviathan, what gets us out of the state of nature is human beings they come to see that their natural condition, rationally, so to speak, is untenable. And therefore they communicate with each other, they contract, they covenant, they lay down their absolute natural right, and they created this artificial instrument called government, or the sovereign. Well, as you're going to see, one philosophic problem with that account is, well, if human beings are not naturally social and didn't form society, and again, Hobbes says that our natural passionate construction is such that we take no pleasure in human company, and even the natural capacity for sexuality. And in class today, I was talking about this, and you'll see this. Rousseau makes especially a lot of this. That the argument is that, well, sexuality, natural sexuality, human sexuality, is not necessarily the gateway to sociality. It's simply the impulse of natural passion, and it doesn't necessarily lead to long-standing or existing social relationships. That the sexual passion is not necessarily a social passion. The other natural passion or relationship, which Aristotle would include, but Aristotle does think that reproduction as a shared good does incline to sociality, that sexuality does lead to natural sociality, is the other natural need that all natural beings have, which isn't just reproduction, which requires association. It's what Aristotle calls an associative good, in that it can only be had in association with another member of the species, reproduction, but also nutrition. Now, it's true in Book 1 of the Politics, Aristotle expands that into the economic goods of life. But let's be clear, this is actually the bond of the maternal relationship. That you could say there's a natural association between mother and child, and that without the mother being present to nurse the child would die, would starve. and therefore for sexuality and the need for maternal support and nutrition in infancy for Aristotle is the ground of sociality, which leads to the family, which leads to property, and so on kind of things. Locke, as you're going to see, Locke and Rousseau believe that this is a fundamental flaw, a mistake, a contradiction in Hobbes's account of the state of nature. How could an unsocial being, an asocial being, that had no natural impulse to associate, in fact, in Hobbes, our natures are so constructed that we can't tolerate each other's company, and that we seek to dominate and destroy each other before they get to us, sort of like Machiavellianism and the prince's need to acquire projected back onto human nature, and which is not a bad way to view what Hobbes is doing, by the way. But then, how did language develop? If you need reason and speech to get out of the state of nature, but the state of nature is not social for Hobbes, then how did language develop? I think, as you're going to see, Locke believes that he has found a different version of that, which is, to summarize here, the first third of his great difference from Hobbes on the state of nature, that, as you're going to see, it's a milder form. The picture is essentially the same that Hobbes sees, that the state of nature is not a good place, even though you're going to see for Locke it's a little more complicated than that. But explaining how we get from natural asociality to the capacity to speech and the capacity to form society and therefore government or political power, as Locke will talk about it in the second treatise, it is a critical issue. Now, there's also another issue that both Locke and Rousseau embrace as a correction of Hobbes's view of the state of nature. And that is did it ever really exist? Was it actually an historical condition for humanity? Because Hobbes says that actually the state of nature probably or might have existed at one time, although he's agnostic on that question, because ultimately to go back into history would be like an exercise of imagination. But he does say the state of nature is real whenever human beings, first of all, it's the real condition between sovereigns in international relations, where there's no common authority over them. And how do they behave? Why, they're always at war with each other, or what peace is called in international relations is just a time between war, when nations rev up to go back to war. So in some ways, Hobbes's argument is the state of nature is an objective phenomenon. It's observable. It's not an imaginary phenomenon between the heads of governments. But also Hobbes says that whenever you're alone, without the actual protection of government over you, then any human being that comes into your purview is actually, you're in a state of nature with that individual. And I've used that example in class as being on I-26 at 3 in the morning when your car breaks down. And you don't necessarily feel relief when you see a set of headlines coming up in the middle of the night. So Hobbes, on the question, is the state of nature real? Hobbes says, yes, it is. Between nations, and when the government is not present to protect you, you're in the state of nature. But on the historical question, again, he seems to be agnostic. Locke, and especially Rousseau, and I'll come back to formulate this a little more emphatically in a second when I talk about the political and philosophic of Locke, and why Locke is a critical figure in modern thought and Western thought. Both Locke and Rousseau do take seriously the idea of an historical state of nature, and in fact feel the necessity of addressing the transition from a historical state of nature to the state of humanity as we observe them today, social and political. But as you're going to see, so I think the Lockean state of nature is both more philosophically satisfying in that it explains the difficult issue of language and reason. It is more philosophically persuasive or full in Locke's understanding because it addresses this question of the historical state of nature and how we got out of the original state of natural primitivity and asociality to human society as we would observe it everywhere today. The second great area of reformulation is, as I said earlier, and we'll come to this probably in our second discussion of Locke, is on the sovereign. And this is where the idea for watching the death of Stalin comes in. Because as we pointed out in class in our discussion of the Leviathan, and also in our tentative initial discussions of Locke, Hobbes says there is no imaginable condition worse than the state of nature. It's, if you remember his great phrase, it's not just war, it's solitary, nasty, brutish, short, and poor. Solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. It's the worst imaginable human condition. Why? Because the terrible fear of violent death is a continuous state of consciousness. And there's no relief from it, I guess, except when you sleep or when you're dead. So for Hobbes, the creation of sovereignty, even and his political recommendation seems to suggest absolute monarchy or the embodiment of an absolute sovereign, because as we saw in the Leviathan, the very definition of sovereignty is absolute, sort of. That is to say that once the sovereign is constituted, Hobbes says no one has a right to disobey the sovereign because, of course, the actions of the sovereign are you. You are represented in the person of the sovereign, and therefore to disobey the sovereign would be for you to be disobeying yourself. And also throwing yourself and society back into a state of nature/war. So you might not want to live under a Stalin, but for Hobbes, living under Stalin is better than living under the state of nature. Locke is going to disagree with that and argue the worst possible condition you could possibly put yourself into is to put yourself under another human being's absolute power. And that is why Locke is the the source of this, on the second question of the formulation of civil society and the sovereignty. This is why Locke replaces the absolute sovereign of Hobbes with what you could call modern constitutionalism, and the rule of law. That political power is only tenable if it is based on the rule of law for psychological and other reasons that we'll see, and only if the sovereign is constituted so that absolute authority is not possible. Hence, the rule of, so Locke is known as a political teacher as the first thinker in modernity to truly require the rule of law as the ground for decent political authority, but then also constitutional containment of the problems of sovereignty through, of course, the doctrine of the separation of powers and checks and balances, as we shall see in the middle part of the second treatise. The third great reformulation of Hobbes in Locke, and subsequently Rousseau, is on the question of the right of revolution. As we saw, Hobbes believes that once sovereignty exists, you have no right to resist. There's no collective right to object to or criticize or reject the authority of the sovereign once it exists, and no individual right to disobey the sovereign. Again, Hobbes is always interesting and says that, okay, but if the sovereign comes to arrest you, then you don't have the right to resist him, but you have the right to kill him. Because if you throw yourself back into the state of nature by disobeying the sovereign, and he comes after you to arrest you, potentially to kill you, your natural right to protect yourself suddenly reemerges. And that's why some of the other interesting peculiarities of natural rights in Hobbes, that no sovereign can compel you to testify against yourself in trial, which is where our Fifth Amendment comes, the right of non-self-incrimination. It comes right out of Leviathan in chapter 21. So Locke, as you're going to see, thinks that not only is the absoluteness of the sovereign in terms of relying upon the personal will of another human being, or being under the personal will of a human being, which is the very definition of slavery. And that's why Locke is also not just a great theorist of the rule of law and constitutional government, but Locke is also the great theorist of liberty, in the sense that Locke argues that it is never justified to enslave yourself to another human. That slavery, and by the way, the terms tyranny and slavery come nearly to be identical in Locke. And as that will point back to the state of nature, because you're going to see the central concept that's the basis of Locke's reformulation of the state of nature is the concept of private property. So much of our discussion in this first lecture will be picking apart Locke's understanding of what property is, what generates it, and why it's natural, and how that leads to answering some of the philosophical conundrums we talked about earlier, especially the rise of language in society, and the way the natural, emotional, or psychological constitution of human beings in the state of nature. And so the great reformulation of nature, the reformulation of the sovereign is the constitutional rule of law, and this last formulation is the development of the right of revolution or resistance, the collective right on the part of the people. And that's why, of all the proximate thinkers to the American Revolution, there are a couple of them that are quite critical. Montesquieu from the 1730s, who was also a kind of a Lockean and reformulated much of Locke's teaching so that it had a French accent, vive la. And also David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, and other theorists of republican government, Sidney, after whom the College of Hampden-Sydney is named. But Locke is clearly the primary star in the constellation of eventual American development constitutional theory, and of course that leads right to the Declaration of Independence, that the people have the right to alter or abolish their form of government when it ceases to be conducive to the securing of their rights. So while there is a debate among scholars as to how Lockean the Declaration of Independence is in the American constitutional order, I'm persuaded that it's pretty Lockean, and we'll explore that concept. So if you're looking in the middle of the notes on the philosophic and political legacy, here I just want to summarize very broadly before we actually start picking Locke's teaching apart to characterize where he stands and why he's so influential. First, I've already mentioned this, but as a theme, this is under C, the political and philosophic legacy. Locke and Rousseau, and you could say subsequent thinkers, Marx, even Darwin, begins to take seriously the historical existence, not just the actual existence today, observably, when there's no common sovereign over you, like the heads of nations, or when you're all alone and unprotected by the civil society. Both Locke and Rousseau, and especially Rousseau, could be understood to be the founders of anthropology, of historical or paleobiology or historical anthropology, because they do think you must explain. If human beings are not naturally political, then you have a philosophic conundrum or task of explaining how did a non-speaking, non-linguistic, non-reasoning, non-associative animal actually make the transition from non-society, from isolated natural existence to sociality. And I think both Locke and Rousseau believe they have a better explanation for that, which corrects the deficiencies and gaps in Hobbes' account. The second, and you'll see, by the way, the theme of a historical account of the development of human nature becomes a major theme in especially Kant and Hegel and Marx and Nietzsche subsequently. So human being is in these subsequent thinkers, kind of starting with Locke, is a being that has emerged historically over time and therefore changes throughout history. That doctrine becomes a powerful doctrine in modern thought called historicism, which argues that human nature is different in different historical epochs. It's not a question of the same being discovering, developing in different circumstances. Rousseau was going to argue that once human society forms and begins to reshape human nature, that human nature acquires this kind of malleability, and this is present in even the 20th century profound existential thinkers like Heidegger, who argues that there is no transcendent natural being, rather there is a historically fluid Dasein, a being that exists in profoundly different modes in history. So Locke can be understood to be initiating this tendency, which becomes a dominant theme in modern thought. Second, Locke, now this is also true in Hobbes, is a pretty thorough materialist psychologist. You don't see so much that in the second treatise, which in some ways is probably his most accessible and widespread book, aside from, by the way, his letter on toleration, in terms of which had pretty practical and long-standing effects in the human world, first in England and then in America. But he has a great and extensive work on the human mind and human psychology in the essay on human understanding. And so he lays out as materialistic a psychology and an operation of human consciousness based upon scientific material causes as much as Descartes does or Hobbes does. And in fact, Locke is one of his best known phrases is a description of the human mind as an infinite, as a tabula rasa, an empty slate. Tabula is like our word for table, slate where you write on, and the rasa, an empty, a blank slate, and that therefore the human mind in its concepts are completely shaped by experience. Now, that's a teaching of Locke which has been somewhat modified or challenged in subsequent decades, because some thinkers and researchers argue that actually the human brain is a remarkably complex pre-programmed machine. If it doesn't have conceptual content programmed into it, that it nevertheless has certain structures which make possible conceptual life, and that to some degree the idea that we're just a kind of a bunch of epoxy glue shaped by material forces, and that when we come out of the womb we're just silly putty to be shaped by forces and conditions. Remember, of course, Locke or any prior thinker prior to Mendel had any notion of genetics, and let alone DNA and this kind of stuff. So that might be a claim of Locke and some immediate subsequent thinkers that which actually, if it hasn't been disproven, there seems to be a good deal of internal construction to the conceptual platform of human consciousness, much more than just a blank slate. But you're going to see that both Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Marx for that matter, are complete materialists. They believe that the human mind is not a free consciousness that can attain consciousness transcending its body, that the human consciousness is a product of the chemical processes of the body, and as Marx will take it, the social, political, and economic structures in society which operate as physical causal forces in Marx. So there is a certain sense in which Hobbes develops this. And Locke fills this out. We're not reading the essay on human understanding in this book, in this course, I should say. Now, the other interesting legacy of Locke is in his capacity as the formation of private property. Not just private property, but the naturalness of private property. And this puts him right in the middle between Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes argues there is no property in the state of nature. The psychological experience of owning stuff, of owning property, and holding down to your internal things as if they belong to you, is not part of the equipment of natural consciousness, primarily because it's so unstable that the idea of extending yourself into an external material thing and extending your body and expending your body's labor into an external thing, there's no opportunity to experience that. You might want to grab a stick and grab a banana or whatever, but it's so violent, that condition is so violent that you don't have a chance to develop an attachment to it. Locke is really going to disagree with that. He's going to argue in the simplest fashion that what human beings are doing in the state of nature, especially the original simple state of nature, is not continuously fighting or combating each other, but rather working, acquiring property. And therefore, as you're going to see, that passion to acquire is not necessarily, does not necessarily culminate in conflict. And as you're going to see, it suggests that the governing passion, if you admit that we have different passions, and there will come times when violent passions, if you get scared or challenged or somebody tries to steal something from you, you'll awaken violent passions and may incline to fight. But this was a really quite different view of natural psychology. That when human beings, it's almost what Hobbes says, when human beings are sleeping, are not sleeping, they're fighting or trying to invade each other and despoil and destroy each other. Locke does not think that's the case, for reasons that we'll see in the opening part of the third of from chapters 1 to especially 5 on property and liberty. So what people are doing, they will fight when push comes to shove, but what they're really trying to do is build up property and create the conditions of a comfortable and transformed existence. More about property and what property is and why it is the source not only of ownership but also value. Those are the three primary areas of Hobbes' teaching which are affirmed and transformed. There's a different state of nature and a different kind of human psychology. There is a different transition to politics and sovereignty, devoid of the absolutism that seems to characterize Hobbes' teaching. And ultimately, there is a doctrine available to the citizenry which informs them that they do have the right to reject an existent sovereign if, in their judgment, their rights are not being secured properly. So, a milder state of nature, a more restrained and milder form of sovereign in the form of the rule of law and constitutional government, and a more aggressive population who perform the final corrective if a ruler goes bad. Hobbes would almost suggest that if a ruler goes bad and starts to terrorize people like Stalin, your constant requirement is to submit to that will, even if you sense that it might lead to your destruction. Hobbes, again, Locke would say that's crazy. To put yourself under the single whim of a single human being means to submit yourself and turn yourself into a slave and turn the tyrant into a master who has a complete power over you, when in effect, since human beings are equal, any one of a human being, once they acquire the power over others, is equally destructive or threatening to all the other humans around you. So it's not just a question of finding the right person, a nice guy. All rulers who are who have limitless power are by definition dangerous. And again, they become tyrants, which becomes like masters over the enslaved populations. And so the last bucket in this reformulation then is to tell to common citizens that that if they think that living under a particular governor or an executive, especially for reasons you'll see, would is going down a slippery slope to endangerment, then they don't have to wait for the slaughter for the tyrant to start mowing people down. If they think they are not being well governed, they have the right to replace the tyrant and to reformulate a new government, which is exactly what the Americans did in the Declaration of Independence. So, so not only is Locke the first great philosophical anthropologist trying to give a concrete and historically plausible account of the actual transition from the state of nature to civil society, and not only is he a materialist psychologist who essentially argues that human beings are relatively mild and prefer to make pottery rather than to make war, as long as they can anyway. And in that sense, he has been described as a proto-capitalist. I don't think the elements in the economic elements in Locke's doctrine are not as formulated as they are in subsequent economic thinkers like Adam Smith, Ricardo, and to some degree even Marx. That is to say, a full description of how the free market would work as the production and distribution of property. But it would be fair to say that Locke is the great theorist of private property, and private property, which means acquiring and holding as much property as you can naturally acquire, is the dominant state of mind and the dominant activity of most human beings, even in the natural condition. And as you're going to see, that's an important thing, because if people are primarily expending the passion to acquire through applying their labor to raw materials, that means the initial and essential and dominant activity of human beings is not conflict. They only come to conflict if there isn't enough resources to go around, or if a person forgets boundaries of property and interferes with another person's property. But in other words, it would be like two store owners who can compete next to each other. Their competition for creating, buying, and selling property does not necessarily put them into conflict. It may put them into competition, but as you're going to see, the kind of human being who enters into business and acquires property and buys land and develops it is actually something like a social being, because and that is, I've just laid out how I think Locke is going to see in property and exchange the development of a human being who not only can develop a rational comparison of different kinds of products and also see the worth that he's putting into a created product, but is also curious to acquire the created products of other human beings through trade and barter. And if you think about it, the development of different kinds of property, and then seeing your own ability to see value in the property you've created because of what you can use it for, and then seeing the kinds of things that other people have created, it turns out Locke, I think, thinks he has explained the rise of society and the growth of language at the same time. It's not so much sex and reproduction that drives people together. In fact, Hobbes was probably right that most people in their natural condition would probably prefer to be left alone to work. But with contact with other human beings and human beings seeing the product of other people's labors, the natural impulse is not to go and steal it from them, but rather to enter into some kind of a barter or exchange relationship. And it's out of that not only seeing the value of different produced goods, but also communicating and reflecting on exchanging goods, that I think that Locke believes that the capacity for language, grown out of the natural ability to see the value in different kinds of property, and and as you're going to see, that certain property lasts longer than others, that the capacity for exchange and commerce, not only the construction of property and the development of property, but then ultimately the friendly exchange of commerce is actually the true beginning of human society. And those initial commercial exchanges would also more likely be the explanation of language, because in order to exchange and barter, you developed some kind of way of communicating the relative value of your goods. So for Locke, property, not the raw urge to stay alive in a dangerous world, but rather relatively peaceful beings placed in the kind of bounty of nature. And as Locke points out, in the early stages of humanity, when we were short, the earth is big, lots of natural resources, plenty for everyone. So if there was plenty for everyone, the likely activity of human beings is not killing each other at the drop of a hat, but only when other human beings became a threat to your acquisition of property, which is your more natural and consumptive activity. So I do think that the production of goods through labor, and then the awareness of the improved value of the good through labor, not only begins to develop your rational perception, you get to see different kinds of property, and you see that they are different for different uses, that's what also inclines you to see that something your neighbor has made or produced, like an apple pie as opposed to a baseball bat, even though you can't use them for the same things, a person developing reason could come to see what you could use a baseball for, and the same for somebody that makes baseballs and you see some useful could be using for an apple pie. And it's that constant and developing ability to see the usefulness in different kinds of property developed by different peaceful human beings that is the actual beginning of society for Locke. So it's goods, it's property, goods in exchange. That's the real mechanism that begins to turn human beings into social creatures. Not the urge to expend sexual energy and reproduce. Not even the urge to protect children through the maternal relationship. But rather a selfish desire to improve your condition and comfort in life, because you see the possibility of exchanging property and getting more diverse and comfortable kinds of property. And so it's ultimately the desire for physical comfort and ownership which becomes the primary central human urge that leads to people willingly associating with each other. Now, just to tie up a couple of things here. To go back to the legacy. So I suggested that not only is Locke the beginning of something like physical or historical anthropology, trying to actually find an imaginary way of how you got from a primitive non-social animal into social society, and it wasn't violence and it wasn't sex. It was trade and commerce that ultimately got human beings used to living with each other and seeing benefit in each other. And out of that would have then created the conditions for the transforming of permanent sexual and familial bonds. So it's not that sex and the maternal relationship led to society. Rather, the beginnings of human social interaction through trade and acquisition of property created stable habits of a society, out of which the sexual and the maternal bond could have actually developed into something like a permanent relationship. And as I mentioned in class, this theory of the generation of value in things, that when you acquire property, you are also creating a new thing. You're creating a product which has value. That will become very powerful, as I mentioned in class later on, for Marx, who is going to adopt the idea that the value of a commodity is equivalent to the amount of labor in it. Now, that turns out to be very problematic for Marxist economists. But part of what Marx was trying to do is to take Locke's concept of that it is it's human labor added to or mixed into an external commodity that actually generates almost all of its labor. I mean, when you see a log on the ground, as nature produces, that's almost useless. It's a log. It's either something you have to step over or hit somebody with or light a fire. It has uses. But once somebody finds out how to flatten a log and turn it into an incipient shovel or something like that, or a spear for that matter, then you can do a lot more with that log. The log now itself is no longer just a natural clump. Human labor has actually been added to it. And in doing so, you've actually extended your body over that and mixed your labor into it. So, if anything, you could say that Locke's understanding of the core fact of human being in the state of nature is that our bodies are our property, and that our body, the physical packet that we live in, is the first act of ownership. That you are the only natural being who can claim that you own your body because you're in it, and its energies are what sustain you in life. So the beginning of Locke's understanding of property and all this kind of transformative role that we've seen is to argue that your sense of ownership of your body, that you see your body as property that you own, is the foundation for almost all other subsequent developments of human consciousness. And that the ability to, because you see what happens, you own the energy of your body. If you take an apple and pick it off a tree, or if you take a log and carve it so that it can cut or something like that, you've done two things. You've mixed the energy. This is his formal definition of property in Book 5. You've made it yours because you have blended the energy and efforts of your body. It's almost as if you extended your body over an external object, and that therefore, in working on it, it becomes yours because the source of its transformation is your energy. But in doing so, you also turned it from something that was owned by everyone and had almost no value into something that was now useful. In making it yours, you actually made it useful. And if everyone else is doing that, then you could say to some degree there will come a point where the division of labor will be seen as profitable. And that is probably, that's the point in which a human society begins to form. When the perception of a mutual advantage of trade of different kinds of products leads to a stable formation of a human group. Now, as you're going to see, there is a certain stage in the progression of that development which becomes very problematic. And that problematic stage is the development of money. Because when society develops money, a key aspect of the natural relationship to our property is undermined. Locke says that in the original state of nature, there's so much natural resources, and that the human population is so slow that that there's plenty to go around, and conflict is relatively rare, and therefore, in that initial state of nature, when everyone is simply busy working on the things they're working on, people are not fighting; they are working hard and they're acquiring. That's the dominant passion in man as a natural being. And it's only when certain kinds of products, which, and the definition of which, by the way, is doesn't spoil very easily. So as you're going to see, the suggestion is when human beings become sophisticated about the things they're working on, you pick apples and you make apple cobblers, and you pick grains and nuts and you make peanut butter, and you take stones and you make houses and walls. And then this shiny gold metal comes along without a particularly intense use, but it does say one thing. It does actually give you the ability to make commensurable different amounts of goods produced by different ways. In other words, once money exists, and money doesn't spoil, that's why Locke's suggestion is that we moved up from goods that did not have a long shelf life. Hence, Locke argues that natural waste had a tendency to limit how much we could acquire in our early primitive state of nature. But once money exists and money doesn't spoil, then that breaks the natural limit on waste, which Locke argues in our original state of nature made us pretty equal. Because if we lived in an apple growing region in which we would all feed ourselves by eating apples, what good would it do to you to acquire 5,000 apples? You could say, well, you'd have 1,000 more apples than your neighbor. The problem is what happens to apples pretty quickly. And that's why people, in working on their needs in different circumstances, start to see different kinds of property and longevity. If you start gathering nuts instead of apples, you'll notice that, for instance, you can keep them longer, and they might be better used for barter, because you're not going to get very far on eBay peddling rotten, wormy apples. But then, as you'll see, when different goods are produced so that they do in fact last longer with more labor in them, then the ability to pick a single commodity which doesn't rot, hence the shiny pieces of gold, that's actually then what destroys the original limit of natural equality in terms of the wastefulness. That natural waste puts a fundamental limit on how much property can be acquired by human. Once money exists, then that connection between property as a form of natural property and equality is severed. And as we're going to see, that's when the original state of nature, which at this point has been peaceful and relatively productive, although, as you're going to see, Locke does share something with Hobbes. Hobbes and Locke think that human beings in the state of nature are unhappy. Why? For Hobbes, human beings are so unhappy because they're always ready to kill each other. They're in constant terror and fighting with each other. For Locke, they are more pacific because they're busy what they're doing in front of themselves, working hard and acquiring property. And since primitive initial property doesn't have great longevity, and one human being can only have so much kinetic energy and can only do so much with natural property. But once you make this transition to a rotting or a permanent form of exchange and property, that permanence means that you sever the connection between how much you can own and how much you can produce. Prior to this time, in primitive conditions, you could own as much as you could produce, and if you tried to own more than that, it would rot if you couldn't sell it. But with money, it turns out money is the great invention, which not only then expands the scale and increases the division of labor and makes society more productive overall in terms of the overall level of comfort and based on a diversity of goods, it also leads to the first real inequalities of wealth. So human beings are equal according to Locke, and in both of their capacities, and that means that basically in their natural condition, human beings can make pretty much the same amount of property. But when different kinds of property that spoil at different rates and have different values, and eventually with the invention of money, it is money that actually suspends and does away with the natural equal limits of acquisition of property. So what happens, of course, is the true inequality of wealth begins to develop. And that's what leads to the transformation of the state of nature into a state of war. Because as long as there is enough of natural a resource to go around for relatively primitive modes of production, there's probably not going to be conflict. But once you have the degree of property production so complex that different goods are being produced that require a universal medium, and that medium doesn't spoil, and that means one person can get lots of that medium, then obviously there's going to be an unequal supply and demand of the nature of the goods of life. And for Locke, at least, that's the point at which money, the final stage of property, does lead to inequalities and therefore leads to a state of war, which will require political correction. All right, we've gone on long enough, so this will be our lecture before Friday, and then what I'll probably do is try to record a lecture after class on Friday when we will continue to watch the death of Stalin.